The first thing I noticed was that the lattice had changed temperature. I had swept that lower chamber 612 times. I knew its temperature the way I knew my own pulse. The ambient read on Relay Station Orveth's lower deck ran at exactly 4 degrees above the ambient of the corridor above it, maintained by residual thermal bleed from the sealed core housing. Always 4 degrees. The instruments logged it. I logged it. 400 years of maintenance records, passed down through every contracted custodian before me, all said 4 degrees. That morning it was 9. I set my equipment case against the bulkhead and looked at the beacon. It filled the far end of the chamber, 12 sides, each one a pale crystalline panel, roughly 2 meters tall, fitted together in a geometry that the survey teams had argued over for a century before losing interest. No seams you could slide a blade into, no access ports, no power coupling that connected to anything still functional on Orveth's grid. The crystalline alloy was the color of old bone in bad light, and in good light, it was the color of nothing at all. It absorbed the spectrum and gave back only the barest hint of its own shape. The fourth survey team had called it inert. The third team had called it extinct. The second team had called it decorative, which was the most insulting conclusion, and the first team, the one that had arrived within a decade of Pelthus Vey going silent below us, had called it dangerous, and locked the chamber, and then argued amongst themselves until their funding ran out. The current consensus, held by everyone who had bothered to form one, was that the beacon core of Relay Station Orveth was a 400-year-old curiosity that did nothing, had never done anything in any living memory, and could be safely ignored by anyone with meaningful work elsewhere. I had meaningful work elsewhere. 3 decks of filter housings, 17 atmospheric scrubbers, and a conduit junction on the upper ring that was developing a calcium deposit no one else had reported yet, because no one else walked the upper ring. But I stood at the entrance to the lower chamber, with my hand on the door frame, and looked at the temperature differential on my wrist unit, and did not move. 9 degrees. I went in. The chamber was 40 meters from the entrance to the core housing. I had that distance memorized in steps, 41 of mine, which was how I knew my stride was slightly shorter than the contracted average the maintenance logs assumed. I counted them out of habit. The deck plates were clean. I had swept them 2 days ago, and the sealed environment kept dust from resettling quickly, but I checked the corners near the housing base anyway, because the housing had a micro gap in its lower left panel seal that collected particulate even in a closed environment, and if I didn't clear it monthly, the accumulation would eventually stress the seal itself, and then I would have a real problem. The gap was clear. I straightened up, and I was within arm's reach of the beacon core, which was not unusual. I had been within arm's reach of it 612 times. I had pressed a maintenance scanner against its housing panels on the lower left 47 times in 3 years of contracted tenure. It had never responded to any of it. I don't know why I touched it with my bare hand. My gloves were on my belt. I had pulled them off to work the panel gap, and they were still there. The rational reason, if I needed one, was that I wanted to feel whether the thermal change was surface level or ambient. That was a reasonable thing to want to know. My palm went flat against the crystalline panel. The panel was warm. Not residual thermal warm. Not bleed through from the corridor warm. Warm the way a living thing is warm. Uneven. Present. Directed. As if the heat were being produced somewhere inside and moving toward the surface to meet me. I did not pull my hand away. The first pulse came 3 seconds later. I felt it before I heard it. A single low frequency moving through the panel into my palm and up my arm like a tuning fork held against the bone. Then the sound. A tone so low it was closer to pressure than pitch, and it lasted exactly as long as one breath. Then silence. Then the glyphs. They emerged along the seam between panels, lines of pale script that I did not recognize, carved into the crystalline surface, at a depth that had not been visible in any light I had previously shone on them. They caught the chamber's overhead lights and threw them back gold. Survey Team 2 had taken 17,000 photographs of this housing's surface and found nothing. Now there were 40, 50, 60 distinct characters, spiraling up from the base of the housing toward the apex of the lattice, and they were brightening as I watched, as if a current were traveling the circuit of the 12 panels in sequence, one panel igniting, then the next, then the next. I did not move. Along the chamber's left wall, mounted at chest height in the order they had been installed, were the 4 survey team plaques. Bronze alloy, each one engraved with the team designation, the inspection date, and their official finding. Survey Team 1, access restricted, potential instability. Survey Team 2, inert. Survey Team 3, inert, status confirmed. Survey Team 4, non-functional, recommend declassification. I had read those plaques hundreds of times. I had cleaned the grime from the engraving with a soft brush and a careful hand, because they were part of the station's historical record, and I took that seriously. I had never once thought about what it meant that 4 separate teams, collectively carrying more instruments and credentials and funding than I would ever see in a lifetime, had stood in this chamber and gotten nothing. I thought about it now. I thought about the fact that not one of them had touched it with a bare hand. I thought about the fact that I was standing here with equipment I had taken off to clear a panel gap, and the beacon was doing things that 17,000 photographs had never recorded. I want to be precise about this, because when I later wrote my account for the IWC relay log, I was told by 2 different administrators that what I described was not consistent with any recorded behavior of predecessor-era signal infrastructure. And I want the record to be exact. I was not doing anything. My hand was on the panel. I was breathing. I had not activated any device. I had not spoken any command string. I had not interfaced with any console or input surface. I had simply placed my bare hand against the housing, and the beacon core of Relay Station Orveth, which had not functioned in 400 years, had begun to wake up. By the time the 4th panel lit, the tone had returned. Not the single pulse, but a sustained chord. 3 frequencies overlapping in a structure that I would later learn was called a resonance braid. 1 frequency descended, 1 climbed, and 1 held the center. The held frequency was the one I felt most, and I felt it behind my sternum and in the bones of my jaw, which was unusual enough that I registered it consciously and then set it aside, because the 5th panel was igniting, and the 6th, and the glyph script was now moving. Not displaying statically but cycling, each character shifting slightly, as if the beacon were scrolling through a stored index, looking for something. It found it on the 9th panel. The cycling stopped. 1 glyph, 3 strokes, a curve, and a descending line, held steady and brightened until it was the only warm light in the chamber. The other 49 characters dimmed to a background hum. The tone shifted. The center frequency I had been feeling in my sternum moved upward, and for a moment it sat exactly at the register of a word I almost recognized, a word in no language I had been taught but that felt like a word I had known as a child and then forgotten. The 10th panel opened. Not metaphorically. The crystalline material separated along a horizontal seam I had never seen, a section roughly 40 centimeters wide, drawing back into the housing like a slow exhale, and behind it was a secondary surface. Darker crystal, almost black, and in it, something was moving. Not mechanical movement, not a display cycling through stored images. Something else, a depth, a resonance, a sense of tremendous distance compressed into a 40-centimeter aperture, the way a corridor looks in a small mirror hung at the right angle. The 11th panel began its ignition sequence. I understood, in a way that was not quite thought, that I was being examined. Not scanned. I had been scanned by the survey team's equipment, and the beacon had not responded to any of it. This was different. This was something looking back at me through that aperture, with something that I could only call recognition, in the way you recognize a voice before you place the name attached to it. The beacon was not reading my credentials. It was not checking my access level. It was finding, in whatever it was capable of sensing, something it had been looking for. The 12th panel lit. All 12 panels were now active, the full lattice glowing, the glyph script running its full circuit, the cord complete and resonant through the entire chamber. The temperature on my wrist unit read 31 degrees. I was still not moving. My hand was still flat against the first panel, which had gone from warm to hot. Not burning, but the sustained heat of a surface that was working, that was in use, that was doing what it had been built to do. Then it spoke. Not through any speaker I could identify. Not through the deck's comm system, which had no power. Not through any medium I could name afterward and have named correctly. The beacon spoke through the resonance, through the cord that was already inside my chest and jaw, and the bones of my hands. And what it said arrived not as sound but as meaning. The way you receive meaning in a dream without hearing the words. You are the signal we kept. That was all. 5 words. I had not known, until that moment, that I was waiting for them. But when they arrived, I understood 2 things simultaneously, the way you sometimes understand 2 things at once, when a third thing clarifies them both. The first, the passive resonance field that Relay Station Orveth had been emitting for 400 years, the low-level broadcast that every survey team had identified and dismissed as inert background noise from a non-functional array, had not been inert. It had been transmitting, slowly, continuously, into the habitat zones of every custodian and technician and inspection crew who had ever lived or worked on this station. Not information, not language, frequency. The base frequency of the Pelthus Ve predecessor civilization's signal architecture, the same frequency that the beacon core was built to receive and amplify. 400 years of passive exposure, generation after generation, absorbed by the people who maintained the station and carried with them when they left. The second, I was the first person in 400 years to walk into that lower chamber without anything between my hand and the housing panel. Not a glove, not a scanner interface. Not a probe or an instrument, or a layer of contracted caution between my skin and the surface. I was also the 3rd generation of my family to hold a maintenance contract on Relay Station Orveth. My grandmother had swept that chamber. My father had logged that temperature differential for 11 years. I had been on this station since I was 4 years old. I was not chosen because I was special. I was chosen because I was the thing the beacon had been broadcasting toward for 400 years, and I was the first one who had gotten close enough, with nothing in the way, to complete the circuit. The resonance held for a long time after the words. The lattice stayed lit. The aperture in the 10th panel stayed open, the depth behind it still present, still watching, patient the way only something very old can be patient. Not waiting for what comes next, but settled into the fact of having waited, and now simply being done with it. I took my hand off the panel eventually. The lattice did not dim, the cord did not resolve. The beacon core of Relay Station Orveth, 400 years extinct by the consensus of every expert who had examined it, remained fully active while I stood there, and it was still active when I filed my report, and it was still active when the IWC survey team arrived 19 days later with their instruments and their credentials and their certainty about what predecessor-era signal infrastructure was and was not capable of. They could not replicate the activation. The lattice did not respond to their scanners. The temperature returned to 4 degrees above ambient when none of them were alone in the chamber. One of their senior analysts asked me, with the polite skepticism of someone who had heard improbable things before, what exactly I had done to initiate the response. I told her I had touched it. She wrote that down. Then she looked at the glyph script, still cycling slowly on the 12 panels, warm and patient and undeniably present, and she did not write anything else for a while. I understood that. Some things sit heavier than the forms they're supposed to go into. I am the signal they kept. I don't know yet what that means in full, but the beacon does, and it has been waiting 400 years to tell someone, and now it knows where I am. I think that's enough for now.